Chapter 8 The Mystery of the Moths. According to the theory of evolution, over millions of years living things became more complex and many different varieties of plants and animals developed. But how could this have taken place? Charles Darwin suggested a mechanism he called natural selection. But does natural selection really work the way Darwin thought it did? Today, even scientists who believe the theory of evolution don't think so. The moths that changed. Nearly all biology textbooks from high school to college tell the story of the British moths that changed. Before 1848, nearly all peppered moths were a lightly speckled gray. There were a few that were almost black in color, but very few. Then the black form began to increase. By 1895, 98% of these moths were black. What had happened? In 1848 there were very few factories in England. The trees in Britain were covered by light-colored lichens or tiny plants. But as factories were built in Britain, smokestacks poured out black smoke and polluted the air. The lichens died out and the tree trunks turned a darker color. But what difference did this make to the moths? When the tree trunks were a light color, birds had a harder time seeing light-colored moths that rested on them. But when the tree trunks turned dark, birds could easily see the light gray peppered moths and ate them. The almost black moths were harder to see against the darker trunks. They survived, and soon there were many more dark moths than light ones. The peppered moths had changed, or at least changed proportions of light to dark colored moths. Other changes in evolution. Charles Darwin is the man who presented the theory of evolution in his book On the Origin of the Species. He developed the idea on a voyage around the world on the British ship Beagle. On that journey in 1835, Darwin made two discoveries that started him thinking. On the Galapagos Islands, Darwin carefully observed the giant tortoises that lived there. He learned that a person could tell which of several islands a turtle came from by the size, color, and thickness of its shell. He also found out that turtles from drier islands fed on tree cactus and had longer necks. Those that lived on wetter islands fed on low-growing plants and had shorter necks. On those same islands there were 26 types of birds, and 13 of them were finches. The finches also had differences. One type ate ground seeds and had a thick, short beak. Another type fed primarily on insects and trees and had a longer, pointed beak. In fact, there were slight differences in the beak size and shape of each type of finch. And each beak size seemed to be related to the kind of food that bird preferred. As Darwin thought about this, he realized that each variation seemed to enable the bird or turtle to adapt better to its environment. It seemed to Darwin that all the finches came from an original stock that had come to the islands. Somehow they must have separated into different subspecies, each with its own special traits. But how? Darwin knew that offspring are slightly different from their parents. He thought that these minor differences might build up until, after many generations, a kind of bird or animal quite different from the first parents might develop. Darwin thought that only changes which better helped an animal or plant fit into its environment would be passed on. Darwin called this natural selection, and it became the keystone of his theory of evolution. Darwin supposed that over the millions of years he believed had passed since the world began, all modern animals had developed from the first living cells as variation was added to variation. And in many school textbooks, the story of the moths of England, along with the stories of the turtles and finches of the Galapagos Islands, is still presented as proof of Darwin's theory of evolution. Theory of evolution and evolution. The word evolve simply means to undergo change. When we write evolution with a small e, It simply means that something has experienced a slow or gradual change. When people speak of evolution with a capital E, it means something far different. Capital E evolution is the theory that 1. Life began as a chance combination of non-living chemicals, and 2. That all living things today developed from one-celled creatures, which 3. Over millions of years gradually changed into the fish, reptiles, birds, and mammals in today's world. We can all agree that evolution with a small e happens. But evolution with a small e is not proof of evolution with a capital E. Darwin did not see this difference. He thought when he discovered the evolution of the tortoises and finches of the Galapagos Islands that he had found the secret of evolution capital E. Darwin believed changes took place in plants and animals all the time. Some of these changes, such as a longer neck or a more pointed beak, helped the organism survive. Some changes hurt rather than helped. The short-necked turtles died out on a dry island because they couldn't reach the cactus fruit. In this way, the long neck trait was selected by nature itself, so the mechanism of natural selection seemed to Darwin to explain all differences we see in plant and animal life today. In 1969, a Time Life book called Evolution used this idea of Darwin's to explain how amphibians evolved from fish. An amphibian is a cold-blooded, smooth-skinned creature, such as a frog, whose young are hatched in water and later develop lungs. According to this book, some 365 million years ago, some of these crossopterygian fish ventured out on land. It is a plausible guess that they lived in streams which dried in drought of summer into a few scattered pools. Did the fish struggle and flop from one dying pool to another for more water? No one knows, but those fish that were able to stay out of the water for a longer time certainly would have been the survivors and left behind offspring with their own greater ability to breathe in the air. Of course, there were fish. Some fish today, like a dogfish, can live out of water for hours, while a bass will die in minutes. But out of water, any fish will soon die, for it has no lungs. The supposed ability of some fish to live a little longer out of water before they die can hardly explain how finned, scaly creatures could change into smooth-skinned, leggy amphibians who do have lungs. Today, few evolutionists believe that Darwin's notion of natural selection can explain the great changes that I think took place between such kinds of animals as fish and amphibians or reptiles, or between reptiles and birds or mammals. Yet many textbooks still present evolution, small e, as evidence for the theory of evolution. What are genes and chromosomes? Chromosomes are largely composed of DNA and proteins. They are like long, thin strings. All along these strings, genes are found. The genes make up the code for the plant or animal's specific characteristics. Each gene affects some trait or body part. They are something like the dots and dashes of the Morse code. The code sequence along the chromosome strings is different for each kind of living creature. Cells in a fish do not contain the code for cells of a bird or cat. Each kind of living creature carries its own code and can reproduce only its own kind. The offspring must reproduce the parent's codes. While no living creature gives birth to a different kind of offspring, offspring are not identical to their parents. For instance, human children may have different hair and eye color from their parents. You may grow up to be taller or shorter than your mom or dad. Each individual will be different in many small ways from his or her parents and from other human beings. Such differences are called variations. We see similar variations in the animal world. There are many different types of dogs. Some are large, some small. Some are hairy, some almost bald. Some dogs have flattened noses, others have long pointed muzzles. Your pet dog has the basic codes for dog, but variations in the dog genes determine its fur color and length and even its breed. Neo-Darwinians. Sometimes there are minor changes in genes, often called point mutations. Present-day evolutionists called Neo-Darwinians think these mutations, along with natural selection, explain the great changes proposed by the theory of evolution. But most minor differences we see in presently living creatures are not explained by point mutation at all. Where do minor differences come from? Scientists who study genes and chromosomes have learned that many differences are built into the genetic material itself. Variable forms of the same gene are called alleles. You have the genes for human eyes, but with the allele a variation that codes for your own distinct eye color. Today we know much about the complicated chemical world of genes and chromosomes, but there is much more to be learned. We understand rules that tell which alleles persons are most likely to inherit, but nothing scientists have learned about genetics suggests any way that one kind of animal can have a different kind of offspring. What about those moths? What does genetics tell us about the British moths that changed color between 1848 and 1895? When the light-colored lichens disappeared, birds could see the lighter moths against the dark tree trunks and ate the moths. But since they could not see the darker moths, more dark moths survived. Because the dark moths had gene alleles for dark color, they had offspring who were also dark. Fewer light-colored moths survived. Before long there were many more dark moths than light-colored ones. There had been a change, evolution, in the moth population. But this change was due only to variations already built into the moth genes. This kind of change does not support the theory of evolution at all. We can say the same thing about the tortoises and finches on the Galapagos Islands. Gene alleles account for the slight changes in the size and shape of the birds' beaks. Those variations already existed within the possible range of size and shape built into the finch genes. As more short-beak finches survived, they had more short-beak offspring. As more long-beak finches survived on another island, they had more long-beak offspring. Yet they remained finches just as the turtles remained turtles, despite the differences in their shells and necks. What is important is that the evolution of subspecies of finches and turtles did not involve processes that can explain the kind of changes required by the theory of evolution. The finches did not turn into something other than birds. Their beaks did not become mouths with teeth. The genetic code held true. The finches were still finches and the turtles were still turtles, just as the moths of England remained moths. Often in writings about evolution, these creatures are used as modern examples of evolution and process. There was change, but the change was evolution with a small e, not evolution with a capital E. What experiments show? Today, many evolutionists have realized that natural selection is limited by a creature's genetic makeup. The genetic codes of most plants and animals contain a great storehouse of variation, and over many generations can produce the kinds of change that Darwin observed. But these changes are simply different combinations of traits that already exist in the creature's genes. A fish cannot suddenly develop the ability to live out of water for the simple reason that this ability is not in its genes. Despite their understanding of genetics, evolutionists have not abandoned their theory. They have proposed that mutations explain how one kind of creature can change into another. A mutation is an error in the genetic code of a particular creature. Mutations are very rare, and when they do occur, they almost always damage the creature. Yet evolutionists argue that once in a great while, a change might occur which would be helpful. They argue that something like this must have happened and that gradually creatures did change to make the many different forms of life on Earth today. Scientists who hold the theory of evolution have experimented for many years with changes in animal features. For 80 years they have worked with a fruit fly called Drosophila. There have been thousands of generations of this fruit fly, and experiments have produced many different mutations. Yet scientist Francis Hitchings summed up the results. Fruit flies refuse to become anything but fruit flies under any circumstance yet devised. Every mutation produces only evolution, small e, and never the kind of changes required by the theory of evolution. Scientists have also experimented with bacteria. Hundreds of thousands of bacteria generations have been studied and their variations examined, yet never has single-celled bacteria been seen to develop into a multi-celled form. French evolutionist Pierre-Paul Grosset concluded, "They do not change." Many scientists now realize that Darwin's idea of how evolution took place was wrong, and there is no evidence to support the neo-Darwinians' idea that major changes in living creatures can take place through small mutations, plus natural selection. In fact, even though scientists have tried, they cannot even make one kind of creature change into another. Were there hopeful monsters? Many evolutionists have now decided that changes from one type of animal to another could not have happened slowly, either by natural selection or by the gradual buildup of mutations. They agree that a reptile could not change slowly into a bird, as Darwin and his modern followers think. During the millions of years it would take while scales turned into feathers and legs became wings, the small gradual change Darwinism relies on would make it harder for the changing reptile bird to survive. Does this mean they have abandoned the theory of evolution? Not at all. They simply claim that massive changes must have taken place all at once. One opponent for this theory is that the fossil record shows that new kinds of creatures appear suddenly and then continue basically unchanged over geologic eras. But what must happen for this kind of change to take place? Well, it must be something like a reptile suddenly turning into a bird all at once. It is as if a dinosaur were watching an egg hatch, and out came a fully developed bird. The animals that evolutionists say must have developed suddenly have been nicknamed hopeful monsters. The new creature must at first have seemed a monster, but it had hope for surviving as a totally new form of life. But is this idea of hopeful monsters at all reasonable? Hardly. First, there is no evidence at all that anything like a hopeful monster could be born. No one has even been able to guess how such a change could take place, since it requires the creation of completely new genetic material. In fact, the more we learn of genetics, the more impossible this kind of sudden change seems. The genetic materials that every living creature has are coded to reproduce only its own kind. There is no way for new genetic codes to develop. Next, even if a hopeful monster were born, for it to reproduce, there would have to be another monster of the opposite sex born in the same place at the same time. If the appearance of one monster seems impossible, how likely is the appearance of two? How hard this must be for people who insist on believing the theory of evolution. They have no way at all to explain how the kind of changes they believe in could possibly have happened. The old idea that changes took place gradually through the selection of helpful variations has been shown to be wrong. Gene alleles rather than mutations explain the kinds of changes we can observe. All that is left is imagination and the blind conviction that if evolution did not happen slowly, it must have happened in jumps. What does the Bible say? In the creation account, the Bible says that God created plants, fish, animals, and birds. Carefully read what the Bible says, and you will find a very special statement that science has shown to be true. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees of the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind." Do you see the special saying that is repeated again and again? God created different kinds of sea creatures, of birds and animals, and God said, "Let each produce according to its kind." The Hebrew word translated kind is a general word. It does not fit any current term used by biologists. In the Bible, it's used to refer to genus, family, order, and species. In Genesis, men identifies the original genetic stock of plants and animals. All the plants and animals that are on earth now have come from these original plants and animals. There are different breeds of dogs, but dogs produce their own kind. A dog and a cat cannot mate and produce a new kind of animal. For a dog to mate, a pair must both be dogs, and their offspring will always be dogs, never cats. Some scientists have made fun of the Bible and the word kinds, but if we understand kind as plants or animals which contained the original code for the many breeds and varieties now on earth, we can see just how trustworthy the Bible is. There is the kind of evolutionary change that Darwin noted so many years ago. But those variations were already built into the genes God gave the first plants or animals when He created all living things.